The first debate we have is the availability of human tissue for research purposes. Jo Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benton. The issue of making samples of human tissue available for use in medical research may seem at first glance like an obscure one, but in fact it is a huge impact on some of the other issues which we commonly discuss in this place, including the development of new medical treatments for common diseases, the safety of patients treated by the NHS, and the ever-controversial matter of scientific experimentation on animals. In today's debate, I will cover how increasing the availability of human tissue to the research community would be to our advantage, and make some suggestions as to how the Department of Health might be able to help make tissue samples more accessible. I first became aware of this issue because of the life sciences in my constituency. Glasgow is very unfortunate to have one of the highest cancer rates in Europe, but what this does mean is that it has become a world-class centre of excellence, with the Beatson Research Centre based in my constituency just outside Glasgow, and indeed shortly due to be building a new translational research centre alongside it. This is also a hub for other companies working in the life sciences industry, for example the biomedical research company Biopta, based in Bearsden in Eastern Bartonshire. Biopta uses fresh samples of human tissue to test out new medical treatments before they get to the stage of clinical trials being carried out. These tissue samples are ones which have been removed from patients during surgery, and for the parts that are not needed for either diagnosis or therapy, they have been donated with the patient's consent for use by researchers. Tissue is therefore not removed for the purposes of research. It's removed during the surgical procedure anyway, most often in order to aid making a diagnosis, such as during a biopsy. A sample is taken, or indeed in some cases an entire lump may be removed, but usually only a tiny amount of it is needed on a slide to examine under a microscope for diagnosis, and the rest is either incinerated or stored for use by researchers. When I visited Biopta, the company's chief executive, David Bunton, explained to me the benefits of testing with human tissue. First of all, testing new treatments on tissue samples can help to protect those who volunteer as subjects in clinical trials from harm. I'm sure we've all seen adverts in newspapers or perhaps in a doctor's surgery or a hospital looking for people to give their time to participate in a study of a new medical treatment. And we've also all heard, sadly, of some of the cases where clinical trials have gone badly wrong, where people have become seriously ill and even died. By testing treatments on human tissue samples first, it's possible to rule out some potentially harmful treatments before they're tried out on human subjects in clinical trials. While there is, of course, no guarantee that a treatment which is tested on tissue samples and appears safe will not cause harm to a living person, currently the various techniques involving live tissue samples are the closest we can get to simulating the use of a particular treatment on a real patient. While basically all drugs are testing on human cell lines, not all of them are tested on human tissue, which reacts in a way that is closer to normal cells in the human body than cell lines which are in an artificial environment. As well as posing a risk potentially to the health of subjects, unsuccessful clinical trials also cost a great deal in terms of time and resources. One of the biggest barriers to the development of new treatments for diseases is actually the huge costs involved and the financial risk in trialling treatments, as there's always a risk that they won't work. And in fact, in many cases, drugs companies expect that 9 out of 10 drugs that they take forward will not ultimately reach the stage of production. So that risk can never be eliminated, but using live human tissue samples can rule out some unsuccessful drugs before the trials are carried out, and that can help to reduce the costs. Another reason for using human tissue samples is it can reduce the need for carrying out experiments on animals. I'm only going to touch briefly on this point, as it is an issue, however, which many members, like many of our constituents across the UK, feel very strongly about, and it may be that other members want to talk further on this issue. I do certainly accept that some testing on animals is still necessary for medical research, but we of course should be pursuing other alternatives where possible, in line with the approach of replacement, refinement and reduction. Despite the benefits of tissue research, which I've outlined above, vast quantities of residual surgical tissue are regularly incinerated as clinical waste. As a result, there is a shortage of human tissue samples available for research. Many of the diseases for which treatments could be developed in this way are common ones, diseases which all of us here will know people who have suffered from. Breast Cancer Campaign reports that there is a serious lack of access to breast cancer tissue available for breast cancer research. This access issue is hampering progress in breast cancer research. Developing new treatments, finding the causes of breast cancer and discovering new breast cancer genes can only be achieved if breast tissue is available to scientists across the UK and worldwide. 1 woman in 9 will be diagnosed with breast cancer in her lifetime. 1,000 women and 7 men die from it every month in this country. Another common disease for which no cure has yet been found is Parkinson's disease, with which someone in the UK is diagnosed every hour. Researchers in the UK are looking to develop new drugs which could slow down, stop and even reverse the condition, and perhaps even find a cure. According to Parkinson's UK, a key challenge is that there is a shortage of human tissue, including intestinal tissue from the gut, available for research. There are then difficulties associated with obtaining it when it actually becomes available. We would therefore welcome any move to increase the amount of tissue which is retained for research purposes, including that which has been removed during surgery. For the first time, it would allow researchers to look at changes in parts of the body in people who are living with Parkinson's. In order for tissue samples to be used for research purposes, a number of things need to happen. First of all, the tissue donor needs to consent to the use of their tissue for the purposes of research. Second, tissue needs to be stored in appropriate condition. And thirdly, there needs to be a mechanism for making researchers aware of what tissue is stored where. Firstly, on the matter of consent. Clearly, it is important that patients should ultimately have the final say in how their tissue is used. However, the current process for gathering consent is clearly not working. In a submission to the Academy of Medical Sciences, the Human Tissues Working Party, which includes a range of groups including the Safer Medicines Trust and Biopta, wrote, "Respect for patients' rights and wishes must always be paramount, and current regulatory requirements are very good at ensuring that anyone who may not wish to donate their tissue does not do so." However, they continue, "The widespread desire amongst members of the public to contribute to medical research in this way frequently goes unfulfilled because many potential donors are not made aware of the possibilities of donation." Well, if I just finish the quote from the organisation, then I'll certainly give way to the Honourable Gentleman. "The situation is often exacerbated by what is widely viewed as a complex and time-consuming bureaucratic process, time constraints amongst staff, and a lack of appreciation amongst hospital staff of the importance of high-quality tissues." Go away to the Honourable Member.
Honourable lady for giving way. I think she's hit on the key point that in a lot of cases people are just not even asked. And same with cord blood, for instance. I think if people are explained what the usage is, what are the benefits that can actually come from this, then people will say yes. But there is an issue that generally people will be asked at a very vulnerable time, and they're perhaps somewhat nervous about what's happening, why are they doing this. So it is something that really needs to be addressed.
I thank the Honourable Member very much for his intervention, and he is absolutely right that very often people are not asked, as I will explain in my remarks in a moment, and indeed there is the question of timing of when that request is made. There is very little public awareness of the need for live tissue, and I think it's fair to say that most people would never think of just proactively offering to donate tissue samples for research, and as the Honourable Member said, when people are approaching a surgical procedure, then it is obviously not uppermost in their mind. Therefore, we do need to ensure that patients are routinely asked if they would like to do so. Currently, it is up to each hospital trust to design and implement its own policy for gaining consent. Before a patient undergoes surgery, he or she will always be asked to sign a consent form giving the hospital the right to operate on them. So in a sense, this would seem like a good opportunity to ask consent also for use of their tissue for research. Indeed, many hospitals do this, but many more do not. Last year, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to every acute trust in England and every health board in Scotland to ask for their surgical consent form. I found that in England, 39% of hospital trusts do have an option on the consent form for patients to donate tissue for research, but 61% do not. In Scotland, the situation is even worse, where 29% of health boards do ask for this on their consent form and 71% do not. In the cases of those trusts that do not ask on the form, some did respond to say they have a policy of requiring their staff to ask patients verbally for consent, but others told me that they do not take tissue for research purposes at all. Of course, the situation in Scotland is slightly different, as although the Human Tissue Act from 2004 applies in Scotland as well, the Human Tissue Authority north of the border is responsible only for transplantation, not for regulation of the use of tissue for research. However, the National Research Ethics Service is UK-wide, and when it comes to procedures for gaining consent for the use of tissue, I really see there is no reason why these could not be UK-wide, so that there is some consistency whether somebody is going for an operation in Dundee or in Doncaster. The Human Tissues Working Party writes, evidence suggests that the vast majority of patients agree to their surplus tissues being used in research. Moreover, they're equally happy for their tissues to be used by academic, biotech or pharmaceutical laboratories, as they understand that many players are required to bring new treatments to patients. Although no nationwide figures are available, research by the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board found that only 5% of surgical patients were being given the option to donate residual tissue. So one option would be to standardise surgical consent forms across the country and ensure that this option is always included. I did discuss this option with representatives from the Human Tissue Authority last year, but they argued that researchers and foundation trusts may resent any attempt to impose a one-size-fits-all solution, such as this one, as they all have different research systems in place. But perhaps more importantly, there is that widespread view, as articulated by the Honourable Gentleman, that when patients are about to undergo surgery, they are perhaps not in the best frame of mind to make decisions about how their tissue might be used. They receive a great amount of information at this stage, including legal and medical information, which can be quite overwhelming, apart from the fact that they, understandably, may be nervous about undergoing surgery. Surgeons might also find this to be a slightly inconvenient time. A surgeon at one London hospital told the Safer Medicines Trust that surgeons simply don't have the time to explain to patients the benefits of donating tissue, and so surgeons simply tick the no box on behalf of their patients. Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board are taking a great interest in this issue, particularly due to the efforts of Professor Barry Gustafson at the University of Glasgow. And they have recommended that pre-surgical assessments could be the best opportunity to discuss this issue with patients. They're now looking to make this standard practice and indeed potentially to use, with the IT developments that may be required for this, the option of a computer screen when patients check in for their pre-surgical appointment, information about tissue donation and the opportunity at that point to click a box on the screen. They do clearly need to make sure that patients have information about what will happen to their tissue if they give consent. And the Glasgow Health Board has produced an information leaflet for patients which explains how and why tissue is stored by researchers and for how long. I think this is a brilliant example of how information might be disseminated, and I will send the Minister a copy and suggest that she might like to consider sharing this leaflet amongst hospital trusts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland as an example of best practice. The Scottish Government is working with schools to promote the benefits of joining the NHS donor register, giving out information to young people about how the register works and offering real-life stories of people who have received transplants and the new lease of life that they have received and enjoyed. A similar scheme could perhaps be developed throughout the UK to make people more aware of the need for surplus surgical tissues for research. In the longer term, we may even aim to reach a stage where hospital staff and the public are both so well informed about the need for surplus tissue for medical research that a system of presumed consent could be implemented. This would, of course, need to follow an education campaign across the country to explain the benefits of research on human tissue. The debate about whether consent for organ donation should be opt-in or opt-out has been the subject of heated debate in this place, not least when my friend, the former member for Oxford West and Abingdon, Evan Harris, introduced a bill to the House which would have brought in a system of presumed consent, which people would therefore have had to opt out of if they did not want to donate their organ. Of course, in that case, the debate was about organs for transplant rather than tissue for research purposes, so the issues are slightly different. But we're still talking about measures which could save people's lives. I personally think in the case of tissue that an opt-out system may even be less controversial, not least in terms of tissue taken from live patients. I certainly take the point that the situation for post-mortem tissue is far more complex. And I would very much welcome the Minister's views on whether any review of the Human Tissue Act in 2004 might take place, and whether this question of opt-in, opt-out for tissue, live tissue samples, may be considered. I understand the Department of Health carried out a review last year of the impact which human tissue legislation has had on the research community, and it found the majority of participants report that human tissue legislation and human tissue authority regulation has had a negative impact on the research sector. Of course, this was not the intention of the legislation, and the drive to ensure ethical practice is commendable and vitally important. But 68% of the people that responded to that review believed that it has made human tissues harder to obtain, and 61% believe it has led to the disposal of potentially valuable tissue. Clearly, the use of human tissue for research must be subject to careful regulation to ensure a very high standard of ethical practice, but this evidence, I think, suggests that the legislation may need to be reviewed. Once consent has been granted and tissue has been removed, the next issue is how and where the tissue is stored in order to ensure it's available for use by researchers wherever it's needed. Currently, most tissue is stored in the hospitals themselves, and it can be very difficult for researchers to find out what tissue is stored in hospitals across different parts of the country in order to access the types of tissue they need for their research. There are more than 100 tissue banks across the UK, some publicly funded and some privately, but scientists' access to that tissue is seriously affected by their location and their own personal contacts, and indeed some institutions are more willing than others to share their tissue stores. Breast Cancer Campaign are in the process of setting up the first national tissue bank for breast cancer researchers in the UK, which will have a policy of equal access for researchers across the country and is being funded by voluntary donations. As well as national tissue banks, another option for improving access to tissue samples would be just to create a kind of database or online system to allow researchers to see what is available where and then make their requests. Encore UK, a national cancer biobanking organisation, have made attempts to set up a virtual network of tissue banks to share tissue with researchers across the country, but with some only limited success. In conclusion, Mr Benson, I maintain that the problem here is not one of funding. It's one primarily of better coordination and implementation of the processes we already know need to be implemented, as well as greater awareness amongst both health professionals and members of the public about the importance of human tissue research. Far too often, this valuable tissue is incinerated rather than being collected for research purposes, even though this is not difficult to do. It's a matter of spreading best practice and information for hospital staff and patients, and making the gaining of consent part of the routine of surgical operations. Where tissue is collected, it's not being made accessible enough to researchers across the country, so I very much hope the Minister will be able to tell us in her remarks whether she believes the Department of Health can facilitate greater coordination both across the NHS and also with academic and research institutions in order to improve the sharing of information and clinical materials such as human tissue. I'm sure all members here will agree that we should be doing all we can to speed up research into treatments for the diseases that I've mentioned and indeed for the many others which I haven't, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's response.